yourself for invasion. This is Indie Invasion.
Welcome to Twisted Tales. Tales set in the world of Twisted, a steampunk skirmish game by Demented Games. This is Eric here from Indie Invasion, and today's tale, The Meeting, written by Peter Overton and read by our very own Mac.
The Meeting. The street filled with an acrid smoke. Amidst the panic of fleeing customers, the staff of the Grey Goose doused small fires with damp bar cloths along with pitchers of beer and water. The ruined Lancelot's great rifle, the lance, had left was clear, not least of which was the shattered oaken beam and the enormous hole in the front wall of the inn. The floor, slick with gore, was strewn with moaning people, all of whom clutched and grasped at great penetrating wounds from the shell's wicked flight in a futile attempt to stop their lives leaking away. In some cases they were assisted by friends and acquaintances, but a great many of them had fled when the weapon had been fired, leaving their companions to an uncertain and probably rather painful fate. In the doorway leading to the street stood Lancelot, casually, almost mechanically, wiping blood from the blade of his sword using a scrap of cloth. By his feet lay two Urkin, their wounds indicating a quick, almost clinical end. The fleeing patrons pushed past him with a curse, the iron gentleman swaying slightly at the collisions from their headlong flight. His countenance remained impassive, barely registering the throng. At his waist fluttered a long strip of parchment. It emanated from a device on his hip. Printed upon it, in a strange, almost spidery script, was a list of sorts. Lancelot glanced down as the device sprung to life with a gentle whir. The list drew back into the machine and emerged again moments later, a red mark across two of the entries. Will and Arthur, Lancelot thought. The list was a string of names, each of whom Lancelot knew he must kill. How he knew this, even he was unsure of, but he was certain of it nonetheless. The two fallen Urkin were apparently Will and Arthur, now marked off his list. Lancelot hated the device. He hated the way it seemed to whisper to him. He hated the way it controlled him, and he hated the killing of innocents. He had no qualms in slaughtering those who deserved it, but the device gave him no choice. Anyone who stood in the way of him getting to his target was expendable, and, as much as it pained him, he slew them without mercy. The regret always came later. The device went quiet. Lancelot staggered slightly as his own thoughts flooded back into his mind. The blacksmith he had slain lay in the bar along with a score of patrons who'd not been quick enough to get out of the line of fire when he took aim at Dodger. He was sure the smith had been a decent man, just in the wrong place, and too brave for his own good. Apart from the expletives and cries from within the tavern, the street went quiet. Lancelot sheathed his sword. He was not certain where to start looking for Bill, the highest priority target on his list, but knew Dodger had vanished very quickly, so the bolt hole couldn't be far, even with the lad's remarkable turn of speed. A figure emerged from the low pall of smoke. Instinctively, Lancelot's hand snapped to the hilt of his sword, but the knight was now in control of himself, and the motion was more for his own protection. Medusa stepped into the pale yellow illumination of a gas lamp and held her hands up in front of her, showing no intent for harm. In Lancelot's mind, something whispered. He knew this strangely garbed woman was an ally in his quest. "Dodger escaped," he said plainly. "He did," Medusa replied, slightly confused. Somehow she knew who the Iron Gentleman was talking about, despite having spoken to no one about this Dodger. "We'll have to track him down then," she continued. "First, though, we need to get away from this inn. I think you may have left rather a mess." "Indeed." Lancelot hefted the lance onto his shoulder and turned. As he did so, there was a shrill cry of a whistle and the clatter of hobnailed boots on cobbles. Two figures ran down the street, shouting and gesturing, their heavy blue coats flying behind them. Peelers. Medusa drew back into the smoke as Lancelot laid the lance down carefully and drew his sword in one fluid motion. The two peelers drew themselves up at the sight of the blade, one tugging a large, heavy-looking firearm from beneath his coat. "Come on now, sir," said the larger of the two. His sleeve bore the stripes of a watch sergeant. "Put that away. There's a good chap." Despite the steady, deep tone of the man's voice, there was uncertainty in his stance. He kept his distance and seemed ready to move away rapidly should the situation require it. Lancelot lowered his blade. The other policeman took aim, stepping up and covering Lancelot with the great, greasy muzzle of his blunt firearm. "Move a muscle, matey, and it will go the poorer for you," he called. There was a faint clatter, and Lancelot stiffened slightly. The list shuddered as two new names emerged. A mental fog seemed to grow from the base of Lancelot's skull, masking his own thoughts and replacing them with the instructions of the engine. Lancelot raised his sword and took a step forwards, a low growl emerging from his lips. The engine was to brook no threat to its plan. "Harry!" the sergeant cried. "Get back, you idiot!" He reached forward and tugged at the peeler's wide collar. The man tripped, his boot catching on an uneven cobblestone. He fell, his gun clattering across the wet street. As he tried to assist the unfortunate peeler, the older man brought his truncheon up in a futile defensive gesture. Lancelot advanced in a deliberate and deadly manner, the list chattering like a mad jackdaw. Both peelers knew things were about to get very, very unpleasant for them. Seemingly from out of nowhere, Medusa appeared. She stood facing Lancelot, her hand raised, and clutching a filigree golden egg that seemed filled with a red mist. Now, Lance," she said, "these folk have caused you no harm. Don't make me hurt you." The list went quiet for a moment. Lancelot stopped. "Flee!" hissed Medusa over her shoulder. "These matters do not concern you. I've held him. I cannot stop him if you should remain." The two policemen needed no encouragement, and hurriedly gaining their feet and some of their composure, they beat a very hasty and somewhat unedifying retreat. As the figures retreated, the list sprang back to life. The two names vanished back into the device, and then reappeared, marked in green. Lancelot sagged. It very nearly happened again. He cursed the device. He could feel parts of his consciousness becoming ragged each time the list took him. "That's most interesting," Medusa remarked, bending in to inspect the device. "I'll have to try and find a way to stop that. Can't have you slaughtering the good folk of London now, can we?" She looked up and smiled slightly. The Iron Gentleman looked back and felt hope for the first time in days. He was sure that he had to stop Bill. He just wanted to do it his way.
Thanks, guys, for listening to today's tales. You can find our Indie Invasion podcast on all podcast platforms, including Podbean, Google, and iTunes. And please visit us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and if you can, support us on Patreon/Indie Invasion. And feel free to email us with any questions or comments at indieinvasion@gmail.com. And remember, guys, don't forget to prepare yourself for the invasion.